Well, Seattle and really Portland have been ground zero for the worst of the rioting in America over the last year. Antifa has been behind it. And, I started tracking the Antifa movement a few years ago when Kshama Sawant revealed who was controlling her on the Seattle City Council. And the socialist Marxist group that she is a part of, they have a very explicit goal, and that is to tear down cities from within, to destroy them, and then to rebuild in a Marxist image. And a lot of people thought, well, this will get a lot better once Joe Biden's elected. And it has not gotten better, because this is not about liberal versus conservative. It's not about Democrat versus Republican, but it's my contention that this is about Marxism versus capitalism. There is somebody who is far more learned than I on all of these issues. Andy now is the New York Times best-selling author. He is the author of a brand new book called Unmasked: Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. And Andy joins us once again here on the Dori Monson Show. Andy, it's always great to talk with you.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Let's start with just the subtitle of your book, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. As I said, I've been saying for years that this is about Marxism versus capitalism. Is that what you believe to be true as well?
That's part of the story, but I think it's actually something bigger. I think it's more about anarchy, anarchist communism in particular, versus the American philosophy. So the whole agenda of the Antifa political movement is to destroy the nation states around the world because they don't recognize any governments. But they view the United States as the main enemy. And that's because the United States has been a force for exporting liberal democracy around the world, property protection rights, freedom of expression, the rule of law. All of that is anathema to their worldview. So they believe that they must destroy the republic, and from its ashes, and that's their words, build a utopia. And it's very grand and theoretical, but then you can look at what happens when they put their plan into action. So last year, for more than 3 weeks, for example, in Seattle, they had taken city property near downtown and claimed it to be an autonomous zone, not under American jurisdiction.
Right.
And they set up a hard border, and they had that border manned by their armed militias. And the city allowed that to happen because they believed that these people were doing it in the name of social justice. And inside, they were radicalizing people with extremist literature. Within days, it devolved into violent shootings and then murders.
Well, and so what is their motivation, Andy? Why are they hell-bent on destroying America?
Because they believe, so when they say they're anti-fascist, when you dive into their ideology, as I write in the book, they remake words and concepts to have completely different meanings from how people understand it, how academics understand. So they don't refer to fascism as just a far-right political ideology that was represented in movements like the National Socialists in Germany or Fascist Party in Italy. They define it really to be anything that is opposed to their political worldview. So they view the United States as a fascist, imperialistic state. They view capitalism, property rights, freedom of expression as vectors for fascism to be spread. So if you go back a few years and think about what they were doing before, they were burning down neighborhoods and cities and seizing territories and buildings. They were involved in political brawls in the streets. Portland was particularly brutal. That's my hometown.
Right.
And it was there that they were able to carry out acts of violence against other citizens. And they were saying that it was bashing the fash, punch a Nazi. And the response from the mainstream left was to legitimize those actions. They thought it was appropriate response to use violence in opposition to somebody's speech or thought.
It's been very disturbing to see how the media covered this over the last year, and it was because they were almost afraid that speaking out against Antifa would somehow be perceived as being against social justice and I mean, when you have all these powerful forces, when you have people in the streets willing to commit acts of violence, when you have feckless leaders like Ted Wheeler in Portland and Jenny Durkin in Seattle, when you have a media that is afraid to really stand up against all of this destruction, both physical and ideological, that's a pretty powerful concept for the average person to have to battle against when you have all these forces lined up against people who are just wanting to protect our way of life.
That's right. I'm really glad you brought up all those different variables. So one question I get asked a lot is, why does it seem like Antifa is a big force now? And that perception of it being like a new phenomenon is not off. Antifa as a movement have been around for a few decades, but it previously was on the fringes of the far left. They were able to move right into the center of the mainstream left because of all the things you just said. So they had support through useful idiots in the media, as well as fellow travelers and sympathizers, and even members who work as journalists. They have the support of the culture. They have the support of foolish politicians like the mayor of Portland, mayor of Seattle, and even some governors as well. And so all of that brought together created this sort of the perfect conditions that allowed for them to continue to grow and to recruit and to embed and make their violence more sophisticated, which is why incrementally through each year from 2016 all the way to 2020, each year it got progressively worse. And then 2020 was when they really showed what they were capable of, which in the example of Portland, that was more than 120 days of recurring violence. And by violence, I'm talking about people setting fires to buildings where people are inside, setting fires to police stations, bringing homemade explosives to the riots and guns and knives, creating no-go zones, and eventually they shot and killed somebody, hunted down a Trump supporter, one of their Antifa security, Michael Rhino. I write about how deadly Antifa actually are.
That was on the streets of Portland. We're talking with Andy No. His book is Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy, and he's going to spend another segment with us here, talk about why Seattle, why Portland, why have we become ground zero. Our conversation with Andy No continues in just a moment here on the Dori Monson Show. All right, I am back with Andy No. His new book is Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. Andy, you're a little bit younger than me. I grew up here in Seattle. You grew up in Portland. My wife grew up right across the river from Portland in Vancouver, Washington. These were places that valued independence, independent thought, hard work. How have Portland and Seattle become ground zero for this absolutely destructive force that is Antifa?
It was nice to be speaking to somebody from the Pacific Northwest, because when I'm describing the conditions for what's happening on the ground, people in D.C. and New York, there's a lot of disbelief.
Yeah.
But so
You're right.
To answer your question, why in particular these cities in the Pacific Northwest? Well, the reason is that these areas are political monocultures, and both Seattle and Portland and some other cities in the Pacific Northwest have had a long history of progressive politics. It's part of the culture. A lot of the people there live alternative and or you could view as weird lifestyles just for the sake of it. So it was always counterculture. And I think that provided kind of a really perfect breeding ground for these extremist movements to take root in these areas, because there was no opposition from the center right, or there's really no Republican presence in any meaningful way in Portland or Seattle. You know, they have no political power, and they're not those who are elected in office, either in city council or as a mayor, they have no need to moderate. They're always pushed more and more to the left. So in 2016, with the election of Donald Trump and the universal hatred of the former federal administration and the former president from those who were duly elected to represent citizens, they turned a blind eye to far left extremism. They actually believed Antifa were, quote, anti-fascist, and they believed that Trump was a fascistic president that needed to be resisted.
And you had Joe Biden, who said Antifa is just an idea and denied that it was even a real force. So let me ask you, we only have a couple minutes left. Why have you're a very smart guy. You could have done anything with your life. You put yourself in harm's way. People have seen your Twitter account where you are in the middle of this. You are hated, and hated to the point where there's some who want you dead. Why have you chosen to make this your life's work? Why do you have such passion for fighting against this?
Yeah, Antifa have actually tried to kill me before. They beat me severely in 2019 in downtown Portland, and I was hospitalized with a brain hemorrhage as a result. And they've continued ever since then to try to finish what they started. I do what I do because I'm not the only one who's been victimized by these terrorists. There's been countless of other people, and the majority of them have absolutely no voice and no way to get their story out. I'm very privileged in that, you know, I get interviewed. I'm speaking with you now. I have a book out. I have a large following on social media. I get published in big newspapers. That is a privilege that I want to use to make sure that I'm fighting for justice for other people who report their instances of being assaulted to police and nothing ever happens. The media ignores what happens to them. So that's why I do what I do, and it does come at a heavy cost, as you said. And for that reason, unfortunately, I've had to, at least for the moment, leave my hometown in Portland. Just there were all these escalating threats against me, and people were showing up to my home, and the police did nothing.
Note that Andy is out of the country as he does this interview, in part because of threats that he's received. So in the 30 seconds we have remaining, what's the end game? What's the end game for our cities that have been taken over by these clowns?
You know, I wish I could be optimistic, but I think the present and near future will be bleak, because all of the variables that allowed the Antifa to grow are still there. Their opposition to Trump was always pretextual. It doesn't really matter that he's not in office anymore. They're going to continue to try to destabilize the areas as they have done since Election Day in November.
It's very scary stuff. It's a great book. It's the most important book of the new year thus far. Unmasked: Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. Everybody in the country's reading it. It's a bestseller, but it is particularly relevant for those of us here in the Pacific Northwest, as Andy has done a great job of chronicling how this group has destroyed once great cities. Andy, I wish you nothing but the best. I wish you safety going forward, and I'll look forward to talking to you again about this sometime soon.
Thank you.
Citizen journalist Andy Null joining us. The book is Unmasked, and it's a great read. It's a disturbing read, but it's a great read. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can text me at 98973. That's 98973. Lots more to come here in the Dori Monson Show.